In the unforgiving desert of 1870s Arizona, where the line between life and death was thinner than a razor's edge, a simple act of kindness toward a starving Apache child would forever change the destiny of a lonely frontier settler. What started as sharing a bowl of beans and cornbread would become one of the most extraordinary love stories ever recorded in the American West. This is not just another tale of cowboys and Indians. This is the true story of how compassion broke through centuries of hatred, how two different worlds collided in the most unexpected way, and how love bloomed in the harshest landscape on earth. A story where cultural barriers meant nothing when measured against the power of human connection. Prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of the Wild West, where honor meant everything, where survival was a daily battle, and where sometimes the greatest warriors were not those who fought with guns and arrows, but those who dared to love across the impossible divide. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small adobe cabin that Thomas McKenna called home. It was the summer of 1873, and the 28-year-old Irishman had been living alone on his modest homestead for nearly 3 years. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the closest town, Tucson, required a full day's hard ride through dangerous Apache territory. Thomas had come to Arizona territory after the Civil War, like so many other veterans seeking a fresh start far from the blood-soaked battlefields of the East. He had served with the Union Army, seen too much death, and carried wounds both visible and hidden. The isolation of the desert suited him. Here, among the towering saguaro cacti and endless stretches of red earth, he could work his small farm in peace, raising cattle and growing what crops the harsh land would allow. But peace was a fragile thing in Apache country. The Chiricahua Apache, led by the legendary Cochise, had been at war with the white settlers and the U.S. Army for over a decade. Both sides had committed terrible acts, and trust between the two peoples seemed impossible. Thomas had heard the stories: wagon trains attacked, homesteads burned, families killed. But he had also heard whispers of Apache children starving on inadequate reservations, of broken treaties and broken promises. Thomas tried to stay neutral in this conflict. He was just one man trying to make a living from unforgiving land. He kept his rifle close and his eyes open, but he had never fired a shot in anger since arriving in Arizona. Perhaps it was his Irish heritage, or perhaps it was simply his nature, but Thomas McKenna believed that hatred only bred more hatred. On this particular July morning, as Thomas stepped outside to check on his small vegetable garden, he noticed something unusual near his well. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or javelina that had come for water. But as he moved closer, his hand instinctively moving to the coal point 44 at his hip, he realized it was something far different. Crouched behind a barrel near the well was a child. A girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with long black hair and wearing a simple buckskin dress. Even from a distance, Thomas could see she was Apache. Her dark eyes watched him with the wariness of a wild animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. For a long moment, neither moved. Thomas had heard of Apache children being used as scouts or spies, but this little girl looked anything but threatening. Her cheeks were hollow with hunger, her lips cracked from thirst. She had clearly been without food and water for some time. Slowly, Thomas raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The girl tensed, ready to run, but something in his gentle movement seemed to calm her slightly. Thomas had always been good with animals, and he sensed that patience would be key here. "Hello there, little one," he said softly in English, though he doubted she understood. "You look thirsty." The girl said nothing, but Thomas could see her eyes dart to the well. Then back to his face. She was clearly desperate for water, but afraid to approach while he was there. Thomas took a step back, then another. "It's all right," he murmured. "Take what you need." Still the girl hesitated. Thomas realized she might not understand his words, but perhaps his actions would speak louder. He walked to the well himself, drew up a bucket of cool water, and poured it into a wooden bowl he kept nearby. Then he set the bowl on the ground and retreated several yards. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing toward the water. The girl's thirst finally overcame her fear. She darted forward like a desert fox, dropped to her knees beside the bowl, and drank deeply. Thomas watched as she cupped the precious water in her small hands, splashing her face and neck to cool herself. When she had finished drinking, she looked up at Thomas again. This time, there was less fear in her eyes, replaced by a wariness mixed with something that might have been gratitude. Thomas's heart ached as he looked at the child. Whatever conflict existed between their peoples, she was just a hungry, thirsty little girl who needed help. He thought of his own sister back in Boston, who had a daughter about this age. What would he want someone to do if his niece was lost and alone in the wilderness? The decision was easy. Thomas walked slowly to his cabin and returned with a plate of cold cornbread and beans left over from his breakfast. He set it down near the water bowl and again stepped back. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of food. For a moment, Thomas thought she might cry with relief. She fell upon the simple meal as if it were a feast, eating with the desperate hunger of someone who had not had a proper meal in days. As she ate, Thomas studied her more carefully. Her buckskin dress was well made, but dirty from travel. Her moccasins were worn thin. Most telling of all, she bore the telltale signs of someone who had been traveling hard and fast, probably fleeing from something or someone. When she finished eating, the girl looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. For the first time, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sure, Iana," she said in Apache, touching her chest. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he recognized that she was telling him her name. He touched his own chest and said Thomas. She repeated it carefully, her pronunciation making it sound exotic and musical. "Thomas." Thomas smiled and nodded. It was a small connection, but it felt like a bridge across an impossible divide. Iana stood slowly, as if testing whether Thomas would allow her to leave. When he made no move to stop her, she took a few steps toward the desert, then stopped and looked back at him. In that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of letting her disappear back into the wilderness, he gestured toward his cabin. "You can stay," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "Safe." Iana tilted her head, considering. The smart thing would be to run, to disappear back into the desert and return to her people. But something about this strange white man with the kind eyes made her pause. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the first kindness she had known in weeks, but Iana took a tentative step toward the cabin. Then another. Thomas smiled encouragingly and led the way, moving slowly so she wouldn't feel trapped. Inside the small cabin, Thomas showed her where she could rest on a pile of blankets in the corner. He brought her more water and some dried fruit he had been saving for winter. Iana ate and drank quietly, her dark eyes never leaving his face. As the day wore on, Thomas went about his normal chores, always keeping Iana in sight so she wouldn't feel abandoned. He tended to his horses, checked on his cattle, and worked in his small garden. The girl watched everything with intense curiosity, particularly fascinated by the way he cared for his animals. When evening came, Thomas prepared a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee. He set out 2 plates, offering one to Iana. They ate in companionable silence as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. After supper, as darkness fell over the desert, Thomas lit a small fire outside the cabin. The flickering flames danced across Iana's face as she stared into the blaze, perhaps thinking of her own people gathered around their fire somewhere in the wilderness. Thomas pulled out a small wooden flute he had carved during the long winter months. Music had always been a solace to him, and tonight seemed like the right time to share it. He played a simple Irish melody, something his mother had hummed to him as a child. Iana's eyes widened with wonder at the sound. She had never heard music like this before, not the drums and chanting of her people, but something softer, sadder, and strangely beautiful. When Thomas finished playing, Iana surprised him by beginning to sing. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying an Apache lullaby that her mother had taught her. The words were foreign to Thomas, but the emotion was universal, a song of longing, of loss, of hope for better days. As her song faded into the desert night, Thomas realized that he was no longer alone. For the first time in 3 years, he had someone to share his solitary existence, even if only temporarily. But Thomas McKenna had no idea that this simple act of kindness toward a lost Apache child would soon bring him face to face with one of the most formidable women in the entire Southwest, a woman whose gratitude would prove far more powerful than any weapon ever forged. In the distance, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, came the sound of horses moving through the night. Iana heard it too, and her body tensed like a bowstring. She looked at Thomas with eyes full of a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Shema," she whispered, a word Thomas didn't understand, but which carried the weight of destiny. Mother. Her mother was coming, and with her would come a confrontation that would test every assumption Thomas McKenna had ever made about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of courage in the unforgiving heart of the American frontier. The sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder through the desert night, and Thomas McKenna felt his heart begin to race. Beside him, young Iana had gone completely still, her small body rigid with tension. Her dark eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, and Thomas could see both hope and fear warring in her expression. Thomas reached slowly for his rifle, which leaned against a nearby rock. Not because he wanted to fight, but because 3 years of frontier life had taught him to always be prepared. Whatever was coming through the darkness might not be as peaceful as the child who had wandered into his life that morning. "How many?" he asked Iana softly, not expecting her to understand, but hoping she might give him some indication. The girl held up 3 fingers, then pointed to herself and made a gesture that Thomas interpreted as family. 3 riders, and they were looking for her. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the circle of firelight. Thomas could feel eyes watching them from the darkness, sizing up the situation, determining whether he was a threat to the child. He remained very still, his hand near his weapon, but not touching it, trying to project calm rather than aggression. A voice called out from the darkness, speaking in rapid Apache. The words were sharp, demanding. Iana responded in the same language, her young voice carrying across the desert air. Then, from the darkness, stepped the most magnificent woman Thomas McKenna had ever seen. She was perhaps 30 years old, with long black hair that hung to her waist and skin bronzed by the desert sun. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a buckskin dress decorated with turquoise and silver, tall moccasins that reached nearly to her knees, and a belt adorned with shells and beadwork. But it was not her clothing that commanded attention. It was her presence. This woman moved like a predator, graceful, confident, and utterly self-possessed. Her dark eyes swept over Thomas with an intensity that made him feel as if she could read his very soul. In her hands, she carried a bow with an arrow already nocked, though it was not yet drawn. Two men remained mounted in the shadows behind her, their own weapons visible in the firelight. Ayana jumped to her feet and ran to the woman, speaking rapidly in Apache. The woman listened intently, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. As Ayana spoke, Thomas caught what seemed to be his name, Tomas, repeated several times. When the child finished speaking, the woman studied Thomas for a long moment. Then, she spoke in English, her voice carrying a slight accent, but clearly understandable. "You are the one called Thomas McKenna." It was not a question. Thomas nodded slowly. "I am." "And you are Ayana's mother." "I am Eatsel," the woman replied, her name rolling off her tongue like music. "My daughter tells me you gave her food and water, that you offered shelter." Thomas could hear something in her tone that he couldn't quite identify. Not gratitude, exactly, but not hostility either. Something more complex. "She was hungry and thirsty," Thomas said simply. Any decent person would have done the same. Eatsel's eyebrows rose slightly at this response. "Any decent person? You know who we are? You know what my people have done to yours and what yours have done to mine. Yet you fed my child." Thomas looked down at Ayana, who stood close to her mother but kept glancing back at him. "I know what I've heard," he said carefully. "Stories of raids and killings on both sides. But when I looked at your daughter, I didn't see Apache or white. I just saw a child who needed help." For the first time, something shifted in Eatsel's expression. The hard warrior mask slipped just slightly, revealing something softer underneath. "My daughter says you played music for her, that you let her sing the songs of our people by your fire." "Music has no enemies," Thomas replied. "Beauty belongs to everyone." Eatsel stared at him for another long moment, then spoke rapidly to the two men behind her. Thomas caught what sounded like argument in their voices, but Eatsel's tone brooked no disagreement. Finally, the men rode back into the darkness, leaving her alone with Thomas and Ayana. "They wanted to take you prisoner," Eatsel explained, as casually as if she were discussing the weather. "To trade you for Apache warriors held by the army. I told them no." Thomas felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool desert air. "And why did you tell them no?" Eatsel walked closer to the fire, her movements fluid and silent. "Among my people, there is a tradition, a law older than the rocks themselves. If someone feeds your child when she is hungry, gives her water when she is thirsty, offers shelter when she is alone, that person becomes part of your family." Thomas blinked in surprise. "Part of your family?" "Not just any part," Eatsel continued, her dark eyes locked on his. "By our law, by our custom, you have claimed my daughter as your own by caring for her. And if you are her father now, then I—" She paused, letting the words hang in the desert air like smoke from the fire. "Then you what?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand. Eatsel smiled for the first time, and it transformed her entire face. The hard warrior became a woman, beautiful, complex, and utterly compelling. "Then, I am your woman," she said simply. "You fed my daughter. Now you are mine." Thomas stared at her, his mind reeling. "But we barely know each other. Our peoples are at war. War is for men who have nothing better to do," Eatsel replied with a dismissive gesture. "You showed kindness to my child when you could have turned her away, or worse. You treated her with respect and gentleness. These things matter more than the color of skin or the language of prayers." Ayana had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Now she tugged at her mother's dress, and spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing between Thomas and Eatcell with unmistakable enthusiasm. "What is she saying?" Thomas asked. Eatcell's smile grew wider. "She says you have gentle hands like a healer, that you fed her without asking for anything in return, and that your music made her heart feel peaceful for the first time since we fled our village." "Why did you flee your village?" Eatcell's expression darkened. "Soldiers came, led by a man they call Colonel Morrison. He said all Apache must go to the reservation at San Carlos. But San Carlos is a place of death. Slow death from bad water, spoiled food, and broken spirits. Some of our warriors wanted to fight to die with honor. Others wanted to surrender and trust in the army's promises. And you?" "I chose a third path. I took my daughter and left. We have been traveling for 2 weeks, looking for somewhere safe, somewhere we could live in peace." She gestured to the desert around them. "But there is no such place. The army hunts us. Some of our own people call us cowards for not fighting or surrendering. We are caught between two worlds belonging to neither." Thomas looked at this proud woman and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt since before the war. Protectiveness, admiration, and something else, something he was afraid to name. "You could stay here," he found himself saying. "Both of you. This is my land, legally claimed and registered. The army has no reason to bother us here, and it's far enough from the main trails that most travelers never pass by." Eatcell studied his face intently. "You would do this?" "Shelter enemies of your government. I would shelter a woman and child who need protection," Thomas replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." "And what would you want in return?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Nothing. You don't have to be my woman or anything else. You could simply be my neighbors, my friends if you choose. I've been alone here for 3 years. I could use the company." For the first time since she had appeared from the darkness, Eatcell looked uncertain. This clearly was not the response she had expected. "You would ask for nothing?" "No payment for your kindness." Thomas realized what she was implying and felt his face flush. "Ma'am, I would never, that is, I would never force or expect anything of that nature. If you stayed, it would be because you chose to, not because you felt obligated." Eatcell stared at him for a long moment, then threw back her head and laughed. The sound was like silver bells in the desert night, clear and musical and utterly infectious. Even Thomas found himself smiling, though he wasn't entirely sure what was funny. "You are not what I expected, Thomas McKenna," she said when her laughter subsided. "Most white men who show kindness to Apache women expect payment of one kind or another." "Then you've been meeting the wrong white men," Thomas replied. "Perhaps I have." Eatcell looked around at the small homestead, the sturdy cabin, the well-tended garden, the peaceful sense of order that Thomas had created in this harsh land. "You live here alone?" "For 3 years now. It gets lonely sometimes, but it's peaceful. I have my animals, my books, my music. It's a simple life, but a good one." "And you would share this simple, good life with strangers?" Thomas looked at Ayanna, who was watching the adult conversation with bright, intelligent eyes. Then he looked back at Eatcell, taking in her strength, her beauty, her fierce independence. "You're not strangers anymore," he said quietly. "From the moment I gave Ayanna water, something changed. I can't explain it exactly, but I feel like maybe this is what was supposed to happen." Eatcell nodded slowly, as if his words confirmed something she had already sensed. "Among my people, we believe that all paths are laid out by the spirits. Perhaps your path and mine were always meant to cross. Does that mean you'll stay?" Eatcell looked at her daughter, who immediately began pleading in rapid Apache. The child's meaning was clear even without translation. She wanted to stay with the kind man who had fed her and played music for her. For now, Eatzel said finally, we would try this thing and see what happens. But understand, Thomas McKenna, I am not a woman who follows. I'm not a woman who serves. If I am to be your woman, it will be as an equal, as a partner. I wouldn't want it any other way, Thomas replied, and meant it. Eatzel smiled again, that transformative expression that lit up her entire being. Then, we have an understanding. But first, there are things you must know about me, about who I am among my people. Tell me, I'm not just any Apache woman. My father was a war chief, and I have led warriors into battle myself. I am skilled with bow, knife, and rifle. I can track a man across stone and kill silently in the darkness. I am called Storm Cloud by my enemies, because I bring destruction that they never see coming. Thomas digested this information carefully. Are you telling me this to frighten me? I'm telling you this so you understand what it means that I choose to stay. Warriors who have followed me into battle against the cavalry think I have lost my mind. They say no man is worth abandoning the fight. And what do you think? Eatzel moved closer to Thomas, close enough that he could smell the desert sage in her hair and see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I think, she said softly, that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from choosing not to have enemies at all. As if to punctuate her words, a coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its mournful cry echoing across the desert. Thomas felt something profound settling into place in his chest, a sense of rightness, of completeness, that he had never experienced before. Tomorrow, Eatzel continued, I will show you how this works, how we live together, what it means to be family in the Apache way. Tonight, we rest and prepare for a new kind of life. As the fire burned lower and the stars wheeled overhead, Thomas McKenna realized that his quiet, solitary existence was about to become something far more complicated and infinitely more rewarding than anything he had ever imagined. The Apache woman had indeed declared him hers, but in doing so, she had offered him something he had never dared hope for, a chance at true love born from the most unlikely of circumstances. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Thomas awoke to find his world completely transformed. Eatzel and Ayana were already up, and the camp bore signs of their efficient presence. A small fire burned cleanly with no visible smoke, a skill Thomas had never mastered. Fresh water had been drawn from the well, and he could smell something cooking that made his stomach rumble with hunger. But most striking of all was the change in the very atmosphere around his homestead. Where once there had been the profound silence of solitude, now there was the gentle murmur of conversation in a language he didn't understand, punctuated by Ayana's occasional laughter. Thomas dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Eatzel kneeling beside the fire, preparing what appeared to be some kind of cornmeal cake in a small iron pan. She looked up as he approached, her dark hair catching the morning light like polished obsidian. "You sleep late for a rancher," she observed with what might have been amusement. "I usually wake with the sun," Thomas replied, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I think having company threw off my normal routine." Eatzel nodded toward where Ayana sat near his small garden, carefully examining his tomato plants. "My daughter woke before dawn. She wanted to see everything in the daylight, your animals, your crops, the way you have arranged your life here." Thomas watched as the little girl gently touched the leaves of his plants with obvious curiosity. "She's welcome to explore anywhere she likes. There's nothing dangerous here. She has never seen a white man's farm before," Eatzel explained, handing him a plate of the cornmeal cake along with some kind of berry preserve. Among our people, we move with the seasons, follow the game, gather what the land provides. This idea of staying in one place and making the earth produce what you want, it is strange to her. Thomas took a bite of the food Eatcell had prepared and was amazed by the flavor. The cornmeal cake was light and slightly sweet, and the preserve had a taste he couldn't identify, but found delicious. This is wonderful. What kind of berries are these? Manzanita, Eatcell replied. I found some growing near your well. You have good land here, Thomas McKenna. The water is sweet, the soil is rich, and you have protected it well. As they ate, Thomas found himself studying Eatcell's face in the morning light. The harsh warrior mask of the night before had softened, revealing the woman beneath. She was beautiful, certainly, but more than that, there was an intelligence in her eyes, a depth that suggested layers of experience and wisdom he could only imagine. Tell me about your life before this, he said, before you had to flee your village. Eatcell was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. It was a good life, mostly. My husband was killed 3 years ago in a fight with Mexican raiders. Since then, I have raised Ayana alone, but our people helped. I had my place in the tribe. I was respected as a warrior and as a healer. You're a healer as well as a fighter? Among Apache women, the two skills often go together. We learn to mend what we break, to cure what we harm. It makes us better warriors, knowing the cost of violence. Thomas thought about his own experience in the Civil War, how he had seen too much death and destruction without any corresponding knowledge of how to heal or restore. Perhaps that was why the war had affected him so deeply. Will you teach me? He asked impulsively. Eatcell looked surprised. Teach you what? The healing. I can set a broken bone or treat a cut, but I know there's more to it than that. I'd like to learn. Something shifted in Eatcell's expression, a softening that suggested he had just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. Yes, she said simply. I will teach you. But first, there are other things we must discuss. Practical things about how this arrangement will work. Over the next hour, as they finished breakfast and Ayana continued her exploration of the homestead, Thomas and Eatcell talked about the realities of their situation. It was a conversation unlike any Thomas had ever had, part negotiation, part cultural exchange, and part something else entirely. In Apache marriage, Eatcell explained, the woman keeps her own property, her own horses, her own weapons. She is not owned by her husband, but chooses to share her life with him. That sounds fair to me, Thomas replied, though I should point out that we're not actually married. Eatcell gave him a look that was half amused, half exasperated. By Apache law, we became married the moment you accepted responsibility for my daughter. The ceremony is just a formality that can come later, if we choose. Thomas felt his cheeks flush. I see. And what does Apache law say about the other aspects of marriage? You mean sharing a bed? Eatcell's directness made Thomas's blush deepen. That is between the two people involved. It is not required, but it is not forbidden either. We will see what feels right as we get to know each other. Despite his embarrassment, Thomas appreciated her honesty. There are no games here, no coy pretenses, just a straightforward discussion between two adults trying to figure out how to build a life together. What about children? Thomas asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. What about them? Do you want more children? I mean, if this works out between us. Eatcell studied his face carefully. Do you want children, Thomas McKenna? I've never really thought about it before. Living alone out here, it didn't seem practical. But now, he looked over at Ayana, who was now attempting to feed one of his chickens by hand. Yes, I think I do. Then, we will see what the spirits decide, Eatcell said, But first we must learn to be a family with the daughter I already have." As if summoned by their words, Ayana came running over, chattering excitedly in Apache while pointing toward the chicken coop. She wants to know if the chickens have names, Eatcell translated. Thomas had never thought to name his chickens, but looking at Ayana's eager face, he realized this was important to her. "Tell her she can name them if she wants to," he said. Eatcell translated, and Ayana's face lit up with pure joy. She immediately began pointing at each chicken in turn, assigning them Apache names that she explained solemnly to Thomas, as if he should memorize them all. "She is giving them the names of famous Apache warriors," Eatcell explained with amusement. "That brown one is now called Cochise. The white one is Mongus coloratus. You have a very distinguished flock." Thomas couldn't help but laugh at the idea of his ordinary chickens bearing the names of legendary Apache chiefs. But seeing Ayana's happiness made it seem perfectly reasonable. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small discoveries and adjustments. Thomas showed Eatcell how he managed his water system, his crop irrigation, and his livestock. She, in turn, showed him Apache techniques for preserving food, for finding useful plants in the desert, and for reading the subtle signs of weather and animal behavior that could mean the difference between life and death in this harsh environment. But perhaps most importantly, they began to learn each other's languages. Thomas had picked up a few words of Spanish during his time in Arizona, and was surprised to learn that Eatcell spoke both Apache and Spanish fluently, along with her careful but clear English. "How did you learn English so well?" he asked during a break in their work. "From missionaries who came to our village when I was young," Eatcell replied. "My father thought it was important to understand the language of our enemies. He said knowledge was a weapon that could never be taken away." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. He also said that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to make him a friend." She glanced at Thomas meaningfully. "I think he would have approved of this situation." By midday, the heat had become too intense for outdoor work, so they retreated to the shade of Thomas's cabin. Eatcell and Ayana seemed fascinated by a small collection of books, and Thomas was surprised to learn that Eatcell could read English as well as speak it. "What is this one about?" she asked, holding up a volume of Walt Whitman's poetry. Thomas felt another flush of embarrassment. "It's poetry. Probably not very interesting to you." "Why would you think that?" "I don't know. I suppose I assumed that Apache culture didn't include much written literature." Eatcell raised an eyebrow. "We have stories, songs, and poems that have been passed down for hundreds of generations. Just because we do not write them on paper does not mean we do not value the beauty of words." Thomas realized he had made an unfair assumption. "You're right. I'm sorry. Would you like me to read you some of Whitman's work?" "Yes. But first, let me share something with you." Eatcell spoke to Ayana in Apache, and the little girl immediately sat up straighter, as if preparing for something important. Then Eatcell began to speak in a rhythmic, musical way that was clearly different from normal conversation. Even though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could feel the power and beauty of what she was saying. When she finished, the cabin seemed to ring with the echoes of her voice. "What was that?" Thomas asked, awed. "An ancient poem about the creation of the world. My grandmother taught it to me, and her grandmother taught it to her. It tells how first man and first woman learned to love each other despite coming from different worlds." The parallel to their own situation was not lost on Thomas. "It's beautiful. The sound of it, even though I couldn't understand the words." "Language is more than just words," Eatcell said. "It is rhythm, emotion, the music of the heart speaking to another heart." Thomas nodded, then opened the Whitman book to one of his favorite passages. He read aloud about the poet's vision of America as a place where people of all backgrounds could come together in harmony and mutual respect. When he finished, Eatsell was quiet for a long moment. This man Whitman, he understood something that many do not. That difference does not have to mean division. Is that what you think we're doing here? Proving that difference doesn't have to mean division. Eatsell moved closer to him on the small bench where they sat. I think we are writing our own poem, Thomas McKenna. A poem about what is possible when two people choose love over fear. The afternoon passed quietly, filled with small moments of connection and understanding. Thomas taught Ayanna a simple song on his wooden flute, while Eatsell showed him how to identify edible plants in the desert. They prepared dinner together, Thomas contributing his knowledge of cooking over a wood stove, while Eatsell added seasoning techniques that transformed simple ingredients into something extraordinary. As evening approached, and they sat around another campfire, Thomas realized that he was happier than he had been in years. The constant low-level loneliness that had been his companion for so long had vanished, replaced by a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. "Can I ask you something?" he said as they watched Ayanna play with a small doll she had made from corn husks. "Of course. Last night, you said that by Apache law, I had become your husband by caring for Ayanna. But what do you feel? I mean, aside from tradition and law, what does your heart tell you?" Eatsell was quiet for so long that Thomas began to worry he had overstepped some boundary. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful. "When I was young, before I married Ayanna's father, I thought love was like lightning, sudden, powerful, overwhelming. And maybe sometimes it is. But watching you with my daughter today, seeing your patience, your kindness, your willingness to learn our ways, I think maybe love can also be like sunrise. Slow, gentle, but impossible to stop once it begins." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "And is that what's happening here? A sunrise?" Eatsell turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think it is. The question is whether you are ready for daylight, Thomas McKenna." Before he could answer, Ayanna came running over with her corn husk doll, chattering excitedly about the story she had made up for it. But as Thomas listened to Eatsell translate the elaborate tale of a brave doll who traveled between worlds to bring peace to warring peoples, he realized that the little girl had somehow captured the essence of what was happening between the three of them. They were indeed traveling between worlds, leaving behind old assumptions and prejudices to create something entirely new. And Thomas McKenna, who had come to the Arizona desert seeking solitude, had found instead the family he never knew he needed. The sunrise Eatsell spoke of was indeed beginning, and with it came the promise of a day unlike any other in the unforgiving beauty of the American frontier. 3 weeks had passed since Eatsell, and Ayanna had transformed Thomas McKenna's solitary homestead into something that felt remarkably like home. The days had fallen into a comfortable rhythm of shared work, quiet conversation, and small discoveries about each other. Thomas had learned to appreciate Apache methods of preserving meat and reading weather patterns, while Eatsell had shown genuine fascination with his books and his careful approach to farming. But on this particular morning, as Thomas stepped outside to tend to his animals, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Dust clouds on the horizon, coming from the direction of Tucson, riders and moving fast. Eatsell appeared beside him almost instantly, her warrior instincts having detected the same threat. Her hand was already on the knife at her belt, and her body was tense with readiness for action. "How many?" she asked quietly. Thomas shaded his eyes against the morning sun. 8, maybe 10 riders. Could be army patrol, could be civilians. If they're looking for us, Then, we face whatever comes, Thomas said firmly. This is my land, and you're my family now. No one has the right to threaten that. Itzel looked at him with surprise. In 3 weeks, she had seen Thomas's gentleness, his patience, his capacity for kindness. But this was the first time she had glimpsed the steel beneath the surface, the backbone that had carried him through a brutal war and 3 years of frontier survival. Ayana, Itzel called to her daughter in Apache. The little girl immediately ran to her mother's side, her own instincts having been sharpened by weeks of flight and hiding. Take her inside, Thomas said. If there's trouble, get her out through the back window and head for the rocks near the north pasture. There's good cover there. But Itzel shook her head. I do not hide from danger. If these men come with hostile intentions, you will need my help. Thomas wanted to argue, but he could see in Itzel's eyes the same determination that had probably made her a feared warrior among her people. This was not a woman who would cower in the face of danger, no matter how much he might want to protect her. The riders grew closer, and Thomas could make out more details. 10 men, all armed, and riding with the purposeful urgency of a military patrol. At their head rode a man in cavalry uniform whose bearing suggested he was an officer. Army, Thomas said grimly. And they're not just passing through. The patrol rode directly to Thomas's homestead and stopped in a semicircle around the small camp. The officer, a man in his 40s with steel-gray hair and hard eyes, dismounted and walked toward them. Mr. McKenna, I presume, the officer said in a voice accustomed to command. I am. And you are? Colonel Morrison, United States Army. I'm here on official business regarding the harboring of hostile Apache fugitives. Thomas felt Itzel stiffen beside him at the name. This was the man who had driven them from their village, who had forced them to become refugees in their own land. I don't know what you're talking about, Colonel, Thomas said carefully. Morrison's eyes had already found Itzel and Ayana. I think you do. We've been tracking 2 Apache fugitives, a woman and child who fled the reservation at San Carlos. Our scouts tell us they came this way. Even if that were true, Colonel, this is my property. Do you have legal authorization to be here? Morrison smiled coldly. Mr. McKenna, we are in pursuit of dangerous criminals. That gives me all the authorization I need. Criminals? Thomas's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. What crime have they committed? Desertion from a federal reservation, resisting lawful orders, and, in the case of the woman, Morrison's gaze swept over Itzel with obvious hostility. Multiple counts of murder during Apache raids on civilian settlements. Thomas felt as if he'd been struck. He turned to look at Itzel, searching her face for some denial of the charges. But what he saw there was not denial. It was the cold, proud mask of a warrior who refused to show shame for defending her people. Is it true? Thomas asked her quietly. I have killed soldiers and civilians who threaten my people, Itzel replied steadily. I have never killed women or children. I have never killed anyone who was not armed and ready to fight. Colonel Morrison looked harshly. How touching. The savage admits her crimes. Mr. McKenna, I strongly suggest you step away from these dangerous individuals. But Thomas remained where he was, his mind racing through everything he had learned about Itzel over the past 3 weeks. He had seen her gentleness with Ayana, her patience in teaching him about desert survival, her genuine desire to build a peaceful life. Whatever she had done in the past, he could not reconcile it with the idea that she was a mindless killer. Colonel, Thomas said slowly, may I ask what specific evidence you have against this woman? Evidence. Morrison's face flushed with anger. Mr. McKenna, I don't need evidence to round up escaped reservation Indians. My orders are to bring them back, by force if necessary. But you just accused her of murder. Surely such a serious charge requires some kind of proof. Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you questioning my authority, Mr. McKenna? I'm asking for basic justice under the law, Thomas replied. This is still America, Colonel, even out here in the desert. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across a gulf of conflicting values and loyalties. Behind Morrison, his soldiers shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Finally, Morrison spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge of threat. Mr. McKenna, you have 30 seconds to step away from those Apache fugitives. If you don't, I'll be forced to conclude that you are aiding and abetting enemies of the United States. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He was one man against 10 trained soldiers. If it came to violence, there was no way he could win. But as he looked at Eitzel and Ayanna, he realized that winning or losing didn't matter. What mattered was standing up for what was right. Colonel Morrison, Thomas said clearly, I am a United States citizen on my own legally claimed property. These people are my invited guests. If you want to take them, you'll have to go through me. Morrison's face twisted with rage. So be it. Sergeant Williams, arrest all 3 of them. But as the soldiers began to dismount, Eitzel stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had led warriors into battle against impossible odds. Wait, she said. Colonel Morrison, I know who you are. You are the man who came to our village and told us we must leave the land where our fathers are buried. The man who said our children would be safe on the reservation. Morrison paused, something flickering in his eyes. That's right. And you chose to flee rather than accept the protection of the United States government. Protection? Eitzel's laugh was bitter. You call San Carlos protection? The water that makes children sick? The spoiled food that kills the elders? The soldiers who take Apache women in the night? That's enough. Morrison snapped. I won't listen to Apache lies. Are they lies? Thomas asked quietly. Colonel, have you actually been to San Carlos? Have you seen the conditions there? Morrison's jaw worked as if he were chewing something distasteful. The conditions are adequate. These people need to learn to live like civilized human beings. Civilized like the men who hunt children through the desert. Eitzel asked, civilized like soldiers who break every promise they make. I said that's enough. Morrison drew his pistol and aimed it at Eitzel's chest. You will come with us now, or I will shoot you where you stand. Thomas stepped between them before he had time to think about it. No, Mr. McKenna, move aside immediately. I won't let you murder an innocent woman. Innocent. Morrison's voice rose to a shout. She's killed more white men than smallpox. Inva, Thomas replied steadily. Soldiers killing soldiers. Warriors killing warriors. That's not murder, Colonel. That's what you call it when your side does the killing. Behind Morrison, some of his men were beginning to look uncomfortable. They had signed up to fight Apache warriors, not to threaten women and children under the protection of an American citizen. Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran with tired eyes, cleared his throat. Colonel, sir, maybe we should reconsider this approach. Morrison whirled on his subordinate. Sergeant, you will follow orders or face court-martial. Yes, sir, Williams replied, but his reluctance was obvious. In that moment of distraction, Eitzel made her move. Her hand flashed her belt and came up with a knife that seemed to appear from nowhere. But instead of threatening Morrison with it, she held the blade to her own throat. Stop, she commanded, and something in her voice froze every man present. You want me, Colonel Morrison? Then listen carefully. I will come with you, but Only if you give me your word as an officer that Thomas McKenna will not be harmed for helping us. Itzel, no. Thomas started forward, but she stopped him with a look. I will also come only if you swear that my daughter will be sent to my sister's family among the Mescalero Apache, not to San Carlos. Morrison stared at her, clearly trying to figure out what advantage he could gain from these demands. And if I refuse, then I kill myself here and now, and you return to your superiors empty-handed. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Morrison obviously wanted his prisoners, but he also clearly hadn't expected this level of resistance from a civilian homesteader or such defiance from an Apache woman. Finally, it was little Ayana who broke the deadlock. She walked calmly to Thomas's side and took his hand, then spoke in clear, careful English that she had been practicing for weeks. "Thomas is my father now," she said, looking directly at Colonel Morrison. "Apache law. You heard him. You heard Apache child. That make you big coward." The simple dignity of the little girl's words seemed to hit the soldiers like a physical blow. Several of them actually looked ashamed, and Sergeant Williams dropped his gaze to the ground. Morrison, however, was unmoved. "The child will come with us. She'll be better off on the reservation than living with this situation." "Over my dead body," Thomas said quietly. "That can be arranged," Morrison replied. But before anyone could make another move, a new voice cut across the desert morning like a whip crack. "I don't think it can, actually." Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching from the direction of Tucson. As he drew closer, Thomas could make out a tall man in a dusty black suit, wearing a badge that gleamed in the sunlight. "Marshal Carson," Morrison said tightly. "This is military business." The marshal dismounted with leisurely grace and tipped his hat to Itzel. "Mom, Mr. McKenna." Then he turned to Morrison with eyes like winter ice. "Colonel, I've got a federal warrant here that I think you need to see." Morrison's face went pale. "A warrant for what?" "For your arrest on charges of theft of government property, falsification of official reports, and cruel treatment of civilian prisoners." Marshal Carson's smile was thin and cold. "Seems some folks in Washington have been taking a closer look at your administration of Apache affairs." The desert morning suddenly became very quiet except for the sound of wind through the sagebrush. Morrison's hand was still on his pistol, but uncertainty had replaced his earlier confidence. "Marshal," Morrison said carefully, "I don't know what lies you've been told, but dash no lies, Colonel. Just facts. Facts about supplies meant for the reservation that ended up in the warehouses of certain Tucson merchants. Facts about Apache men who disappeared from custody without explanation. Facts about the real reason why so many Apache families have been fleeing San Carlos." Thomas felt hope beginning to stir in his chest, but he was afraid to believe that this nightmare might actually be ending. Marshal Carson continued, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Colonel Morrison, you're under arrest. Sergeant Williams, you and your men will escort the colonel back to Tucson immediately." "Sir," Williams said, relief evident in his voice. "What about the Apache fugitives?" Carson looked at Itzel and Ayana, then at Thomas. "I don't see any fugitives here, Sergeant. I see a man on his own property with his family. Nothing illegal about that." Morrison's face was now purple with rage. "Marshal, this is outrageous. You can't possibly dash. Colonel, you can come quietly or in chains. Your choice." As Carson snapped handcuffs on Morrison's wrists and the soldiers prepared to escort their former commander back to town, Thomas felt Itzel's hand slip into his. Her touch was warm and strong, and it grounded him in the reality that they had somehow survived this crisis. "Is it really over?" he asked Marshal Carson. For now, Carson replied. But, Mr. McKenna, you should know that your situation here is still complicated. There are people in Washington who are starting to question the whole reservation system, but change comes slow in government. You might want to keep a low profile for a while. As the soldiers rode away with their prisoner, Thomas found himself alone once again with Eitzel and Ayanna. But this time, the isolation felt different, not lonely but protective. They had faced their first real test as a family, and they had emerged stronger. Thomas, Eitzel said softly as they watched the dust clouds disappear toward the horizon. Yes, when that man pointed his gun at me, you stepped between us without hesitation. You were willing to die to protect us. Thomas looked into her dark eyes and saw something there that took his breath away. Not just gratitude, but something deeper and more enduring. I love you, he said simply. Both of you. I would have done anything to keep you safe. Eitzel smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, Thomas saw tears in her eyes. And I love you, Thomas McKenna. Completely. Forever. As they held each other in the morning sun, with Ayanna chattering excitedly about the excitement that had just passed, Thomas realized that their love had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger than ever. They had proven that they were willing to fight for each other, to risk everything for their makeshift family. The hardest test was behind them, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that even greater challenges lay ahead. Love might have conquered fear, but would it be enough to overcome all the obstacles that stood between them and the life they were trying to build together? 2 years had passed since Marshall Carson rode away from Thomas McKenna's homestead, leaving behind a family that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. In those 24 months, the small adobe cabin had grown into a proper ranch house, complete with additional rooms, a covered porch, and improvements that spoke of permanence and prosperity. But the most significant changes were not in the buildings or the land. They were in the 3 people who had chosen to build their lives together against all odds. Thomas stood on the porch in the early morning light, watching Eitzel work with their horses in the corral. She moved with the fluid grace that had first captured his attention, but now there was something additional in her bearing, a contentment that spoke of a woman who had found her place in the world. 10-year-old Ayanna burst through the front door, carrying a slate covered with careful English letters. Over the past 2 years, Thomas had become her devoted teacher, and she had proven to be a remarkably quick student. "Thomas, look what I wrote," she called out, using the English she now spoke as fluently as Apache. Thomas examined her work with the pride of father. "Excellent, sweetheart. Your handwriting is getting very neat. Mama says I write better than most white children now," Ayanna said with unmistakable pride. "Your mama is right." Thomas ruffled her dark hair affectionately. "What would you like to learn today? Can you teach me about the law books? The ones that talk about property and marriage?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty advanced material. Why are you interested in law?" Ayanna's expression became serious beyond her years. "Because I want to understand how the white man's law works. Mama says knowledge is power, and that Apache people need to understand both worlds if we're going to survive." The wisdom in those words never ceased to amaze Thomas. This child had experienced more upheaval and danger in her young life than most adults ever would, yet she faced the future with determination and hope. "All right," Thomas said. "After breakfast, we'll start with some basic legal concepts. But first, help me call your mother in. I have something important to discuss with both of you." Ayanna ran to the corral, and soon Eitzel approached the house, her riding skirt swishing around her boots. She had adopted some elements of white women's clothing over the years, but always in her own distinctive style that honored both cultures. "You look serious this morning," she observed, reading Thomas's expression with the accuracy that comes from deep intimacy. "What has happened?" "Nothing bad," Thomas assured her quickly. "But we do need to talk. All of us together." They gathered around the kitchen table that Thomas had built during their first winter together. This table had become the center of their family life, the place where they shared meals, where Ayana did her lessons, where Thomas and Eatcell planned the future of their growing ranch. "I received a letter yesterday from Marshal Carson," Thomas began. "Colonel Morrison's trial is finally over." Eatcell's hand tightened slightly on her coffee cup. Even after 2 years, the memory of that confrontation still had the power to affect her. "What was the verdict?" she asked. "Guilty on all counts. He's been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison." Thomas paused, then continued with obvious relief. "But more importantly, the trial brought attention to conditions on the reservations. There's going to be a complete investigation, and Carson thinks real reforms are coming." "And what does this mean for us?" Eatcell asked. Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "It means we're safe. Carson says there's no interest in pursuing the old charges against you. Officially, you're free to live wherever you choose." Ayana clapped her hands together with delight. "Does this mean we don't have to worry about soldiers coming in anymore?" "That's exactly what it means," Thomas said, smiling at her enthusiasm. But Eatcell was quiet, and Thomas could see that she was processing this information on multiple levels. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Eatcell was silent for a long moment, staring out the window toward the desert that had been home to her people for countless generations. "I am thinking," she said finally, "about choices. For 2 years, we have been hiding from the world, building our life in secret. Now you tell me we are free to choose how we live openly." Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Are you saying you want to leave?" "No." Eatcell's answer was immediate and firm. "I'm saying I want to choose to stay. There's a difference between staying because you have no choice and staying because you have chosen to make a life with someone you love." She turned to face him directly, her dark eyes blazing with the intensity that had first captured his heart. "Thomas McKenna, I want to marry you. Properly, legally, in the eyes of both your law and mine. I want the whole world to know that I am your wife, and you are my husband." Thomas felt his heart leap with joy, but he forced himself to consider the implications carefully. "Eatcell, are you sure? Even with the changes Carson mentioned, there will still be people who won't accept our marriage. It could make life difficult for all of us, especially for Ayana." Ayana spoke up before her mother could answer. "Thomas, I've been thinking about this too. I know some people will always see us as different, as wrong somehow. But I also know that what we have here is real and good and strong." The wisdom in her young voice amazed Thomas yet again. "Go on. Mama taught me that Apache people believe everything happens for a reason. You fed me when I was hungry, and that brought Mama to you. You both chose love over fear, even when it was dangerous. Now we're a real family, and we should let the whole world know it." Eatcell reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand. "When did you become so wise, little one?" "I had good teachers," Ayana replied with a grin that was pure mischief. Thomas looked at these two extraordinary women who had transformed his life so completely and realized that his own choice had been made long ago. The day he first shared his food and water with a hungry Apache child, he had started down a path that led inevitably to this moment. "Then, let's do it," he said. "Let's get married. Properly and legally and with the whole territory knowing about it." Eatcell's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you would say that." Over the next hour, they made plans with the enthusiasm of people who had finally decided to claim their happiness openly. They would travel to Tucson, where Marshall Carson could help them navigate the legal requirements. They would invite the few friends they had made among their neighbors, good people who had come to accept their unusual family over the years. But most importantly, they would have an Apache ceremony as well as a legal one, honoring both traditions that had shaped their love. "There is one more thing," Eatsell said as they finished making their initial plans. "Something I have been waiting for the right time to tell you." Thomas looked at her expectantly. "I am a child," she said simply. The words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the woman who had just given him news that changed everything once again. Are you certain?" he managed finally. "I am certain. The baby will come in late spring." Ayanna let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the chickens in their coop. "I'm going to have a brother or sister." Thomas stood up slowly and walked around the table to where Eatsell sat. He knelt beside her chair and placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child," he whispered in wonder. "Our child," Eatsell confirmed. "Born free, born to two people who chose love over everything else." As Thomas held Eatsell and Ayanna wrapped her arms around both of them, he marveled at how completely his life had been transformed. 3 years ago, he had been a lonely man trying to carve a living from harsh land. Now he was part of a family that defied every convention of frontier society and was stronger because of it. 6 months later, on a perfect April morning, Thomas McKenna and Eatsell were married twice in the same day. The first ceremony was held in Tucson's small church, with Marshall Carson serving as best man and a handful of friends as witnesses. The second ceremony took place at sunset on their own land, conducted by an elderly Apache medicine man, according to traditions that were old when the Spanish first came to this desert. Ayanna, now proudly calling herself Ayanna McKenna, served as flower girl for both ceremonies, switching effortlessly between the beautiful white dress she wore in church and the traditional Apache wedding clothing she donned for the evening celebration. As the Apache ceremony concluded and the guests began to feast around a bonfire under the stars, Thomas found a moment alone with his new wife. She was beautiful in her traditional wedding dress of white buckskin decorated with turquoise and silver, her long hair adorned with desert flowers. "No regrets?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "Only one," Eatsell replied, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Thomas felt a moment of alarm. "What?" "I regret that it took us so long to make it official," she said, laughing at his expression. "I have been your wife in my heart since the day I declared you mine. This just makes it legal." As if to emphasize her point, she placed his hand on her rounded belly where their child grew strong and healthy. "And what about you, Thomas McKenna? Do you regret feeding a hungry Apache child that day?" Thomas looked around at the celebration taking place on his land, Apache and white neighbors sharing food and stories, children playing games that combine traditions from both cultures, his wife glowing with health and happiness, and his adopted daughter teaching an elderly rancher some Apache words. "Never," he said firmly. "Feeding Ayanna was the best decision I ever made. Everything good in my life flows from that moment. Even knowing how much trouble we brought to your peaceful life." Thomas pulled Eatsell into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring who might see. When they broke apart, he whispered in her ear, "Especially knowing that peace is overrated when you can have adventure with the people you love." As the celebration continued around them and the desert night bloomed with stars and firelight, Thomas McKenna reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A simple act of kindness toward a hungry child had led to love beyond his wildest dreams, a family that defied convention, and a happiness he had never thought possible. The Apache woman had indeed declared him hers that first night, but what she had really given him was the chance to declare himself, to choose love over loneliness, courage over fear, and hope over the cynicism that the war had planted in his heart. 5 years later, as Thomas stood on the same porch where this story began, he watched his 4 children, Anna, now 15, and preparing for teacher's college, 8-year-old Miguel, who could track a rabbit across solid rock, 6-year-old Elena, who had inherited her mother's healing touch, and baby James, who slept peacefully in his arms, playing the garden that Eatsell had expanded into something approaching paradise. Their ranch had prospered beyond his wildest dreams. Eatsell's knowledge of desert ranching combined with Thomas's careful management had made them one of the most successful operations in the territory. More importantly, their success had helped other families, both white and Apache, see that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Ayana had become something of a local celebrity, the first Apache girl to complete a white education while maintaining fluency in her native traditions. She planned to return after college to start a school that would teach both cultures to children of all backgrounds. As Eatsell approached the porch carrying a pitcher of lemonade, her face glowing with the contentment that comes from a life well lived, Thomas marveled again at the woman who had changed his world with a simple declaration. "You fed my daughter. Now you are mine." "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Eatsell asked, settling beside him on the swing he had built for these quiet evening moments. "I was thinking about destiny," Thomas replied, "about how one small act of kindness can change the course of multiple lives." Eatsell smiled and leaned against his shoulder. In Apache tradition, we believe that every person has a spirit guide who helps them find their true path. I think maybe Ayana was your spirit guide that day, leading you to the life you were meant to have. And what about you? What was your spirit guide? Hunger, Eatsell said without hesitation. If my daughter had not been hungry, if she had not needed help, we would never have found you. Sometimes the things that seem like problems are actually gifts in disguise. As the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, and their children's laughter echoed across the land they had built together, Thomas McKenna knew that Eatsell was right. The hunger that had driven a lost Apache child to his well had led to the greatest feast of all, a feast of love, family, and belonging that would nourish them for the rest of their days. The Apache woman's declaration had indeed made him hers, but in the end, they belonged to each other and to this harsh, beautiful land that had witnessed the birth of their impossible love. In a time and place where such love should never have survived, they had proven that the human heart recognizes no boundaries when it finds its true home. And in the growing darkness of another peaceful desert evening, as Thomas rocked his youngest child and watched his wife direct the bedtime routines of their older children, he offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the day that changed everything. The day he chose to feed a hungry child and discovered that the greatest adventures begin with the smallest acts of kindness.